The wind up in the San Juans had a taste to it, a sharpness like sucking on a cold iron nail. Silas Thorne knew that taste. It meant the season was turning, the high passes tightening their throats against travelers, preparing to choke off the world with snow. He sat astride his horse. Barnaby, a gelding that had seen 16 winters and looked to be feeling every single one of them in the stiffness of his knees. The animal blew hard, his breath pluming in the thin air, shifting his weight on the scree. Silas reached down and patted the horse's neck, feeling the damp sweat under the coarse hair. The animal was honest, but honesty did not pull a pack through 5 feet of powder. If Silas stayed up here in the high lonesome without a fresh mount, he would be walking by November and dead by January. He turned the horse's head downhill, away from the granite spires that poked holes in the hard blue sky, and toward the haze of wood smoke gathering in the valley floor far below. Down there lay the settlement of Granite Creek, a stain of timber and mud where men gathered to trade lies, whiskey, and livestock. It was late summer, the time when the heat broke and the frantic need to prepare for winter set in. The descent took the better part of the morning. By the time the hooves struck the packed earth of the valley floor, the air had thickened, growing heavy with the smell of sagebrush and the darker, muskier scent of cattle. Granite Creek was swollen with activity. It was Horse Fair Week, a chaotic ritual where ranchers, drifters, and cavalry buyers collided in a clouded mess of dust and commerce. Silas rode into the edge of the corrals, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his felt hat. He was a man who preferred the company of pine trees to people. People were complicated, noisy, and usually wanted something you did not want to give. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking an inch into the pulverized manure and dust that coated the ground. He tied Barnaby to a hitching rail that had been chewed by 100 bored horses and unhooked his pack. The noise was a physical weight. Men shouted bids. Auctioneers rattled off prices in a cadence that sounded like stones tumbling down a chute, and cattle bawled in the holding pens. But under the noise, there was a tension Silas recognized. It was the tension of men who had been drinking since noon and were looking for a place to put their anger. He moved through the crowd, a tall shape wrapped in buckskins that had been smoked dark and mended with sinew. He carried a Henry rifle in a scabbard across his back, and the knife at his belt was not for show. Men stepped aside for him, not out of respect, but out of the primal instinct to avoid something that looked harder than they felt. He was looking for a roan or a solid bay, something with a deep chest and good lungs. He circled the main corral, watching a ranch hand demonstrate a gelding that looked skittish. Silas shook his head and moved on. That was when he saw the fence. It was a split-rail fence near the secondary corrals, slightly apart from the main auction block. A group of men had gathered there, laughing low in their throats, a sound that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck stand up. He looked past the shoulders of a dusty cowpuncher and saw what they were looking at. A woman was sitting on the top rail. She was not resting. She was perched there, hands folded in her lap, boots hooked on the lower rung, sitting with a stillness that was unnatural. She wore a faded calico dress that had been scrubbed until the pattern was a ghost of what it used to be, and a man's oversized coat was draped over her shoulders. She looked at nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, somewhere past the heads of the men staring at her, past the mountains, past the world. Silas stopped. The sight hit him wrong. It felt like a trapped jaw snapping shut on a boot. It was the placement of her, displayed like a saddle, like a heifer. He stepped closer, his movement quiet. "You fellas looking to buy or just looking?" a voice boomed. Silas shifted his gaze to the speaker. A man stood by the fence post, leaning back with a proprietary arrogance. He was dressed better than the drovers, in a black vest and a clean white shirt that was already staining with sweat at the collar. His face was broad, red from sun and drink, with a mustache that hid a mouth accustomed to smiling without mirth. This was Marcus Vane. Silas knew the name, though they had never spoken. Vane ran the biggest spread in the lower valley, a man who used the law like a bludgeon to widen his fences. Beside Vane stood a clerk, a small man with ink-stained fingers and a ledger clutched to his chest like a shield. She is a worker, Vane said, his voice carrying over the crowd. Good cook, washes, mends. But she has got a debt to settle. A heavy debt. I am looking to sell her contract to a man who can handle the interest. Silas looked back at the woman. She did not flinch at the words. She did not look at Vane, but Silas, who had spent 20 years watching elk and cougar, saw the tells. He saw the way her jaw was clamped so tight the muscle leaped under the skin. He saw the shallow, rapid rise and fall of her chest. She was terrified. She was a trapped animal waiting for the hammer. He stepped into the circle. The other men glanced at him, then looked away, uneasy. "What is the debt?" Silas asked. His voice was gravel, low and scraping. Vane turned his eyes to Silas. They were cold eyes, pale as winter ice. "Room and board," Vane said, "for 6 months, plus advances on wages she never earned. Transportation fees from St. Louis. The cost of the clothes on her back. It was a lie. Silas knew it, and every man standing there knew it. It was the oldest trick on the frontier. You get a person alone, without family. You charge them for the air they breathe until they owe you their life. And then you find a judge who owes you a favor to stamp the paper. It was slavery by another name, dressed up in ink and legal words. "Let me see the book," Silas said. Vane chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. The clerk took a half-step back. "The book is legal. Friend," Vane said. "Stamped by the circuit judge this morning. Sarah here signed her mark. Didn't you—" "Sarah?" The woman, Sarah, did not answer. She kept her eyes on the distance. Silas moved until he was standing next to the fence, close enough to smell the lye soap on her skin and the fear radiating off her like heat. He looked up at her. "You signed that paper?" he asked quietly. She shifted her gaze. Just for a second. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a profound exhaustion. "I made a mark," she said. Her voice was flat, drained of all inflection. He held my hand and guided the pen. It was a warning. She was telling him to walk away. She was telling him that hope was a dangerous thing to bring into this circle, and she wanted no part of it. Silas felt a cold anger rising in his gut. It was not the hot, blinding rage of a younger man. It was the cold, calculating anger of a man who knows that fighting a bear requires a plan, not just a shout. He looked at Vane. "How much?" Vane smiled. "It was an ugly thing. $400. That covers the debt and my trouble." The crowd murmured. $400 was a fortune. It was the price of a small herd, or a year's wages for a top hand. It was an impossible sum for a washerwoman's contract. "I will pay the debt," Silas said. Vane's smile faltered, then sharpened. "You will pay it?" "I will pay it to the court," Silas said. "Clear the books." She walks away. Vane laughed, and the men around him joined in. Nervous, sycophantic laughter. "You do not understand the market." "Mountain man," Vane said. "I am not looking for a payout. I am looking to transfer the indenture. I need the labor, or the value of the labor. The contract sells to the highest bidder." It was an auction. Vane was selling a human being in the middle of a horse fair, hiding behind a sheet of paper. "$200 for the contract," a man in a greasy duster shouted from the back. $250, another yelled. He was a miner, eyes bright with whiskey. The woman on the fence tightened her grip on the rail until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. She did not breathe. Silas looked at her. He saw the life she was heading toward. He saw the brutality of the mining camps or the cruelty of Vane's bunkhouse. He saw a slow death by usage. $300, Silas said. Vane looked at him, surprised. "You have $300 in gold? Trapper?" "I have trade," Silas said. Vane waved a hand. "Cash or equal value." $350, the miner shouted. Silas unslung the pack from his shoulder. He dropped it into the dust with a heavy thud. He undid the straps and kicked it open. Inside were pelts, beaver, thick and prime, harvested from the high lakes where no one else went. Marten, fox. It was a winter's work, a year of freezing nights and solitary days. "All of it," Silas said. "That is 300 in furs at any post in the territory." Vane looked at the furs. He licked his lips. He was a businessman, and greed was his compass. But he was also a man who liked to win. $3.75, Vane said smoothly. The debt has gathered interest in the last hour. The crowd went silent. The miner spat and turned away. He could not match that. Silas stood still. He had the furs. He had a pouch of coin in his belt, maybe $40. It was not enough. He looked at the woman again. She was looking at him now. There was no pleading in her eyes, only a terrifying resignation. She expected him to fail. She expected him to pick up his furs and walk away. Silas reached over his shoulder and pulled the Henry rifle from its scabbard. It was a beautiful weapon, the stock polished walnut, the barrel blued steel. It was the tool that kept him alive. It was food, protection, and law in the high country. He laid the rifle on top of the furs. The rifle and the furs, Silas said, and the coin in my pocket, $420 value. Vane stared at the rifle. He knew quality. He looked at Silas, trying to find the bluff. There was no bluff. Sold, Vane said. The word hung in the dusty air. Vane gestured to the clerk. Write it up. Transfer the indenture to Mr. What is your name? Thorne, Silas said. Transfer the contract to Mr. Thorne. The clerk scribbled frantically. He tore the sheet from the ledger and handed it to Vane. Vane signed it with a flourish, then held it out to Silas. She is yours. Thorne. Mind she does not run. She has a habit of running. Silas did not look at Vane. He took the paper. He picked up his empty pack. He left the furs. He left the rifle lying in the dust. He felt a phantom weight where the weapon should have been on his back. He walked to the fence. Get down, he said to the woman. She hesitated, then swung her legs over and dropped to the ground. She was taller than she looked on the fence, but thin, wiry. She stood just out of arm's reach, watching him. Silas held up the paper. He looked at the dense, crabbed handwriting that spelled out her life in hours and dollars. Is this it? He asked. That is the copy, she said. Her voice was trembling now, a fine vibration like a plucked wire. The original is in the book. Silas looked at the paper. He looked at Vane, who was already counting the furs. Silas stepped over to a small fire where a blacksmith was heating branding irons nearby. The heat radiated against his shins. He held the paper out. What are you doing? Vane called out, his voice sharp. That is a legal document. Silas dropped the paper into the coals. The paper curled, brown at the edges, then burst into a yellow flame. The ink vanished. The signatures twisted and turned to ash. In 10 seconds, it was gone. Silas turned to the woman. You are done, he said. She stared at the fire. Then she looked at him. He expected relief. He expected tears. Instead, her face contorted. A flush of red anger shot up her neck. Her eyes narrowed into slits of fury. You fool, she hissed. Silas blinked. Excuse me? You fool, she repeated, the words escaping through clenched teeth. You think burning a paper stops him? She gestured toward Vane, who was staring at the fire with a look of thunderous insult. He has the ledger, she whispered harshly. And now you have humiliated him. He won't let us walk. He will claim you stole the contract. He will claim you coerced the sale. He will come after us. Silas looked at Vane. The rancher was not smiling anymore. He was whispering to 2 of his men, hard men with low-slung guns. They were looking at Silas, and they were looking at the woman. We have to go, Silas said. Now! She did not argue. The anger was still there, but the fear had returned, sharper and more immediate. Silas grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with urgency. She flinched, pulling back, but then fell into step beside him. They moved fast, weaving through the labyrinth of corrals. I need a horse, Silas said. I can ride, she said. I know, but I sold my rifle. We are light on trade. He still had Barnaby, but Barnaby could not carry 2, not at speed. Silas went to a trader he knew, a man named Jensen, who owed him a favor for a guided hunt 3 years back. Jensen, Silas said, walking up to the man's wagon. I need that favor. Jensen looked at Silas, then at the woman, then at the commotion starting to ripple out from where Vane was standing. You stirred up the hornet's nest. Silas, Jensen said quietly. I need a horse. A strong one, and I have got no coin left." Jensen sighed. He pointed to a sturdy dun mare tied to the wheel. "Take her. She is green, but she has got heart. But you get out of here. Vane is already gathering a posse. He is saying you threatened him." Silas nodded. He untied the dun. He checked the cinch on Barnaby. "Get up," Silas said to the woman. She put a foot in the stirrup of the dun and swung up. She rode with a natural grace, her back straight. "What is your name?" Silas asked, swinging onto Barnaby. "Clara," she said. "Clara Reed. Ride fast. Clara," Silas said. They kicked the horses into a trot, then a lope, threading their way out of the crowded fairgrounds. As they hit the edge of town, Silas looked back. 3 riders were mounting up near the corrals. Dust was rising. They hit the open road, the hooves pounding a rhythm of escape. The valley floor stretched out before them, a vast expanse of sage flats and badlands that offered no cover for 10 miles. They rode hard. The horses lathered, their breathing loud in the afternoon heat. Silas kept checking over his shoulder. The 3 riders were there, black specks in the distance, but they were persistent. They were not closing the gap, but they were not losing ground. The sun began to dip toward the western peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The air cooled rapidly. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. "We need to get off the flats," Silas shouted over the wind. "Where?" Clara shouted back. "The foothills. There is a cut in the rock about 4 miles west. We can lose them in the scree. They pushed the horses." Barnaby was wheezing, his head low. Silas felt a pang of guilt. He was asking everything of the old horse. They reached the edge of the badlands as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The ground turned slick. They slowed to a walk, guiding the animals up a narrow, twisting trail that wound between towering sandstone formations. The light failed. The world turned into gray shadows and black pits. The rain turned to sleet, stinging their faces. "Up here," Silas said. He found a rocky overhang, a shallow cave cut by wind and water into the side of a cliff. It was not much, but it was dry. They dismounted. Silas led the horses into the back of the shelter, out of the wind. He didn't have a fire kit. It was in the pack he had left. He cursed silently. He had his knife, his bedroll which was tied behind his saddle, and a small pouch of jerky. That was it. He unrolled the blankets. "Sit," he said. Clara sat on a stone, wrapping her arms around herself. She was shivering violently. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving room for the cold to bite. Silas draped a blanket over her shoulders. She stiffened, but did not pull away. "They aren't going to stop, are they?" she asked into the darkness. "No," Silas said. "Not tonight. The storm will hold them down in the valley. They won't track us in this mud." "But tomorrow is tomorrow." He sat opposite her, his back against the stone wall. He could barely see her face in the gloom, just the pale shape of it and the dark hollows of her eyes. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Her voice was steady now, but quiet. Silas chewed on a piece of jerky, thinking, why had he? He had gone for a horse. He had ended up with a fugitive woman and a bounty on his head. "I don't like traps," Silas said simply. She let out a short, bitter sound that might have been a laugh. "You just stepped into a bigger one," she said. "Vane owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. You didn't buy my freedom, Mr. Thorne. You just bought a share of my trouble." Silas looked out at the curtain of sleet falling across the mouth of the cave. He missed the weight of his rifle. He felt naked without it. "Where are you from?" "Clara?" he asked. She hesitated. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind howling through the canyons. "A river town," she said finally. "East of here. It doesn't matter. The name is gone. My family is gone. Dead or gone. Same thing in the end." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I worked in a laundry," she said, "then a kitchen. Then I made a mistake. I trusted a man who said he had work in the territory. He sold the debt to Vane before we even crossed the Missouri." Silas watched her. She was not asking for pity. She was stating facts, laying out the geography of her life like a map of bad roads. Men in those towns, she continued, her voice hardening. They think if a woman is alone, she is loose. If she has a story, she is guilty of it. Vane used that. He told the judge I was a runaway thief. The judge didn't ask for proof. He just looked at my shoes and signed the paper. Silas understood. In the West, poverty was often treated as a crime, and solitude as an admission of guilt. We can't go back down, Silas said. No, she said, and we can't stay here. So where do we go? Silas looked up toward the invisible peaks shrouded in the storm. Up, he said. My cabin is 2 days' ride. High country. The snow will cover our tracks. And then we survive the winter. She looked at him across the dark space between them. You think you can hide me, she said. I think I can keep you alive. She shook her head slowly. That is not enough, she said. Vane has the paper, as long as he has the paper, and the law backs him. I'm just a runaway property. You can't just buy safety. Silas, she used his name for the first time. It sounded strange on her tongue, heavy with accusation. We have to win it, she said, or they will bury us both. Silas looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. She was right. He had thought destroying the copy was a gesture of freedom, but it was just a gesture. The reality was recorded in a ledger in a valley full of men who wanted to see them hang. He nodded slowly in the dark. First, we live through the night, Silas said. He leaned his head back against the rock and closed his eyes, listening to the storm try to tear the world apart, knowing that the real storm was the one climbing the trail behind them. The ascent into the high country was a slow, grinding punishment that stripped away the softness of the valley mile by unforgiving mile. The air grew thin, losing the heavy warmth of the sage flats and taking on the metallic bite of granite and ice. Here, the pine forests were not the welcoming woods of storybooks. They were dark, tangled masses that looked like bruises against the pale limestone of the slopes. The creeks did not bubble. They roared, white-frothed and angry, carrying meltwater cold enough to burn the skin off a hand in 10 seconds. Silas Thorne rode in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the back trail. He knew how sound traveled in these canyons, bouncing off rock walls, deceiving the ear. He knew that a rider could be hidden in the timber 50 yards away and remain invisible until the muzzle flash. Clara rode the dun mare behind him. She rode with a grim determination that Silas had not expected. Most town women, even the working ones, broke down after the first day of hard climbing. The saddle sores, the cold, the sheer indifference of the landscape usually crushed them. But Clara Reed sat straight, her jaw set in a line that mirrored the stone ridges above them. She did not complain. She did not ask how much farther. She simply kept the mare moving, her eyes tracking Silas's back as if he were the only fixed point in a spinning world. They made camp that second night in a grove of aspen near the timber line. The altitude was making the horses blow hard, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Silas dismounted and began the ritual of survival. It was a language of movement he had spoken for 20 years, and he began to teach it to her without fanfare. Watch the cinches, he said, his voice low. The cold shrinks the leather. You ride a loose cinch on a slope like this, and the saddle will roll. You will go over the edge. Clara nodded, her fingers clumsy with cold as she worked the buckles. She watched him strip the gear off Barnaby, watched how he rubbed the old horse down with a handful of dry grass to stimulate the blood. She mimicked him with the dun mare. She was not gentle, she was efficient. He showed her how to build a fire that gave heat without throwing a beacon of smoke into the sky. Use the dry squaw wood, the dead branches under the canopy. Keep it small. Feed it slowly. She watched him set a snare line near the creek, her eyes narrowing as he demonstrated the trigger mechanism. You do not use bait? She asked. Not up here, Silas said. Curiosity kills more rabbits than hunger. You set it on the run where they travel. She watched him handle the wire. His hands were large, scarred, the knuckles swollen from years of breaking and freezing, but they moved with a delicacy that contradicted his size. There was no cruelty in the way he set the trap. It was just mechanics. It was just dinner. I thought mountain men were savages, she said quietly. warming her hands over the small, smokeless fire later that night. That is what they say in town. Drunks and brutes who forgot how to be human. Silas stirred the beans in the tin pot. Some are, he said. Some men come up here because they are not fit for anywhere else. The mountains don't make you better, Clara. They just make you more of whatever you already were. What are you, then? She asked. Silas looked at her across the flames. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of her face, making her look younger and older all at once. I am a man who likes quiet, he said. She did not trust him. He could see it in the way she sat, muscles coiled, ready to bolt. She did not trust his kindness because she had no frame of reference for it that did not come with a price tag. But she trusted his competence. She saw that he knew how to keep the dark at bay, and for now, that was enough. They reached his cabin on the afternoon of the 4th day. It was built into the side of a ridge, tucked under the overhang of a massive granite shelf that protected it from the avalanches that scoured the slope in January. It was small, built of rough-hewn logs that had turned gray with weather. The roof was sod and bark. It looked less like a building and more like a natural growth of the mountain. Silas reined in Barnaby and slid from the saddle. He walked to the door, a heavy slab of timber on leather hinges, and pushed it open. The smell of stale wood smoke, cured fur, and dust drifted out. He turned to Clara. She was still on her horse, staring at the cabin. Her face was pale. To him, it was sanctuary. To her, it was just another isolated room where a man could do whatever he wanted, and no one would hear her scream. "Get down, Clara," Silas said softly. "The horses need water?" She dismounted slowly. She walked toward the door but stopped at the threshold. She stood there, looking into the gloom of the interior, her boots rooted to the dirt. It was a border she was afraid to cross. Silas did not push her. He did not tell her it was safe, because safety was a lie she would not believe. Instead, he unpacked the mule, carrying the panniers inside, brushing past her without touching her. He lit a lantern and hung it from a hook in the low rafters. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing a single bunk built against the wall, a cast-iron stove, a table with one chair, and walls lined with traps and tools. He turned to face her. She was still in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray sky. Silas walked to the table. He pulled a knife from his belt, not his main hunting knife, but a smaller, sharp blade with a bone handle. He set it on the table. Then he pointed to the bunk. "You sleep there," he said. He pointed to the floor near the stove. "I sleep there." He looked her in the eye, his voice flat and hard, stripping away any ambiguity. "The door has a bar on the inside," he said. "You can drop it when you sleep. If you want to leave, the horses are outside. If you want to stay, you work. But understand this. Clara Reed, there is no debt here. I did not buy you. I bought a fight with Marcus Vane, and that is my own business. You owe me nothing, not coin, not work, and not your body." He gestured to the knife on the table. "Keep that on you," he said. "If I ever forget what I just said, you use it." Clara looked at the knife. Then she looked at him. Her chest rose and fell in a shuddering breath. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She picked up the knife, testing its weight, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. "I will take the bunk," she said. That first week, the silence in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. They moved around each other like two stray dogs in a small alley, wary of teeth. The nightmares began on the second night. Silas was sleeping on his bedroll near the stove, the dying embers casting a dull red glow on the floor. He woke instantly at the sound, a sharp, strangled gasp, followed by the thrashing of limbs against the wooden bunk. He sat up, hand automatically going to the revolver near his head. Clara was fighting invisible hands. She was tangled in the wool blanket, kicking out, whimpering words that made no sense. "No," she whispered. "No, please, the book. The book is wrong." Silas stood up. His instinct was to go to her, to shake her awake. But he stopped. He remembered the look in her eyes at the horse fair. He remembered the way she flinched when he moved too fast. If he touched her now, in the dark, Caught in her terror, she would not see a rescuer. She would see another attacker. He grabbed the chair from the table and dragged it to the middle of the room, halfway between the stove and the bunk. He sat down heavily, letting the wood scrape against the floor. "Clara," he said. His voice was calm, pitched low. "You are in the high country. You are safe." She gasped again, sitting bolt upright, her eyes wide and unseeing in the dark. She scrambled backward until her back hit the log wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Silas did not move toward her. He sat on the chair, his hands resting on his knees, visible in the dim light. "It is just a dream," he said. "Just the wind." She stared at him, her breathing ragged. She looked around the room, orienting herself. She saw the stove. She saw the traps hanging on the wall. She saw the man sitting 10 feet away, making no move to close the distance. He wasn't touching her. He wasn't demanding she calm down. He was just present. He was a solid fact in a world of shifting terrors. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't be," Silas said. "Go back to sleep. I will watch the door." He stayed in the chair until dawn broke, gray and cold through the single greasepaper window. He learned something that night, and she learned it too. That comfort didn't always mean being held. Sometimes, comfort was just knowing that the person in the room with you wasn't going to take anything from you. 2 weeks later, the world tried to find them. The snow hadn't come yet, but the air smelled of it. Silas was outside, splitting stove wood, the rhythm of the axe echoing off the cliffs. Clara was inside, mending a tear in his canvas coat. Silas stopped mid-swing. He heard the click of a horseshoe on stone. It was distant, down the trail, but it was distinct. He dropped the axe and moved to the door. "Get your things," he said. "Hide them under the floorboards." Clara didn't ask questions. She moved with the speed of the frightened. She shoved her small bundle of clothes and the mending kit into the crawl space beneath the loose plank Silas had shown her. She smoothed the rug over it. "Get in the loft," Silas said. "Stay quiet. Do not move unless I tell you." She scrambled up the ladder to the small storage loft above the rafters, burying herself behind a stack of cured hides. Silas stepped back outside, picking up his axe. He resumed splitting wood, his back to the trail, his muscles loose but ready. The rider appeared 10 minutes later. It wasn't Vane's men. It was a man on a mule, wearing a black coat that was green with age and dust. He wore a flat-brimmed hat and carried a Bible in a saddlebag that looked like it held more whiskey than scripture. It was Reverend Caldwell, a circuit rider who traveled the mining camps, preaching salvation for $1 and burying the dead for $2. "Afternoon, brother," Caldwell called out, his voice oily and loud. Silas buried the axe head in the stump and turned. "Afternoon. Reverend, you are a hard man to find. Thorn, I haven't seen you at the post in a year. I like it that way," Silas said. Caldwell dismounted, stretching his legs. He looked around the clearing, his eyes darting like lizards. He was looking for whiskey, or food, or sin. "Mighty long ride up here," Caldwell said. "I'm heading over the pass to Silverton. Thought I might beg a cup of coffee." Silas gestured to the stump. "I have water. Coffee is for trading." Caldwell chuckled, but it was a dry sound. "You always were a charitable soul." He sat on the stump, wiping his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "You missed the excitement down in Granite Creek," Caldwell said, watching Silas closely. "I heard there was a fair," Silas said, leaning against the cabin wall, blocking the door. "Oh, more than a fair. A scandal. A kidnapping." Silas kept his face stone. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. Marcus Vane. You know him. Righteous man. Pillar of the valley. He had a contracted worker stolen right out from under him. A woman. A thief, they say. Robbed his house and then ran off with a mountain drifter." The story had already twisted. Vane was smart. He knew that in the West. Truth was just the story that got told the loudest. By making Clara a thief, he justified the hunt. By making Silas a kidnapper, he justified the hanging. They got posters up all the way to Durango. Caldwell continued. $500 for the man, $200 for the woman's return. They say the man is a brute. Forced her away at gunpoint. Silas felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He forced it still. Sounds like bad business, Silas said. Terrible business. Caldwell agreed. Sheriff is deputizing men. Vane has got hired guns scouring the foothills. They say they will hang the man on sight. No trial, just frontier justice. Caldwell stood up. He walked toward the cabin door. You wouldn't have seen anyone pass this way, would you? Thorne, a man and a woman, maybe looking for shelter? Silas didn't move. He stood in the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame. He looked down at the preacher. I see elk, Silas said. I see wind. I don't see people. And I don't like visitors who ask too many questions. Caldwell stopped. He looked at Silas's eyes, then at the axe resting in the stump. He took a step back. Just asking. Brother, just doing the Lord's work. Trying to bring a lost lamb home. She is not lost if she ran, Silas said. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He smiled, and it was a smile full of rotten teeth and malice. Well, I best be moving on. Silverton won't wait. He mounted his mule. He tipped his hat. Watch yourself. Thorne, the mountains are getting crowded. Silas watched him ride away. He watched until the mule disappeared around the bend in the trail. He stood there for a long time, listening. He knew Caldwell. The man was a gossip and a coward, but he wasn't stupid. He had seen the two horses in the corral. He had seen the fresh track coming up. Silas went inside. You can come down, he said. Clara climbed down from the loft. She was shaking. He knows. She said, he suspects, Silas corrected. He will tell them. Yes, he will sell the information for a bottle of rye in the next town. Silas paced the small room. He was torn. Part of him wanted to ride after Caldwell and ensure his silence. That was the old way, the violent way. But killing a preacher, even a crooked one, brought a kind of heat that never cooled down. We have time, Silas said. He has to get to Silverton. Then word has to get back to Vane. We have 3 days, maybe 4. And then? And then we will have company. The threat tightened the air in the cabin, but it also dissolved the distance between them. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They were co-conspirators in a siege. Routine became their language of intimacy. They cooked together, shoulder to shoulder at the small stove. Silas mended a bridle while Clara readied the furs he had trapped. One evening, a storm rolled in, burying the cabin in wind and sleet. The fire was the only light in the world. Clara sat on the rug, greasing her boots. Silas was sharpening his knife. Why did you never marry? Clara asked suddenly. Silas paused, the blade hovering over the whetstone. I am not built for a town, he said, and women don't live long up here unless they are born to it. You think I won't live long? Silas looked at her. Her hands were rougher now, her face thinner, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I think you are harder than you look. Clara, she smiled. A small, fleeting thing. I used to think love was about being chosen, she said softly. Back in the river town, I saw the girls getting married, walking into houses their husbands bought. I thought that was safety. I thought that was what I wanted, to be picked. She looked at the fire. Then I learned. She said, being chosen just means you are the one they want to own. Vane. He chose me. He picked me out of a line of girls at the agency. He said I had good teeth and a strong back, like I was a mule. Silas felt a familiar darkness curl in his gut. Ownership isn't love. Silas said, it is just hunger with a contract. Clara looked at him. You are a violent man. Silas, I've seen how you look at the trail. I saw how you looked at the preacher. Silas set the knife down. I was a scout for the army, he said, before I came up here, down in the territories, Arizona, New Mexico. He looked at his hands. We were supposed to be keeping the peace, protecting settlers, but mostly we were just clearing the land for men like Vane. I killed men who were defending their homes because a map said it wasn't their home anymore. He looked up at her, his eyes bleak. I killed a man in a bar in Tucson. He was drunk. He drew on me. It was self-defense. The law said, but I knew him. I knew he had a wife. I knew he was just scared and angry. I put a bullet in his chest because I was faster, not because I was right. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the gray in his beard. I came up here because I am good at harm. Clara, that is my trade. I can keep you alive. I can kill anything that comes through that door. But don't mistake that for goodness. I am just a weapon you are using to survive. Clara stood up. She crossed the small space between them. She stopped in front of him. She reached out and took his hand. The hand that had killed men, the hand that set traps. Her fingers were cool and rough. A weapon doesn't destroy a contract to save a stranger, she said. She squeezed his hand. It was an electric touch, terrifying and tender. Silas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He wanted to pull her into him. He wanted to bury his face in her hair and forget the wind outside. But he didn't. He looked at her, seeing the fragility she was trying to hide and the strength she was trying to build. If he touched her now, if he took what he wanted, he would be just another man taking something from her. He gently pulled his hand away. Get some sleep. Clara, he said, his voice rough. She looked at him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his. Then she nodded. She went to her bunk, but the air between them hummed with the things they hadn't done. 3 days later, the wolves arrived. It was mid-morning. Silas was checking the perimeter, a habit he couldn't break. He found the sign a half-mile down the ridge. Shod hooves. 3 riders. They had stopped, checked the ground, and moved on. They were circling. Silas ran back to the cabin. They are here, he said. Clara dropped the pan she was holding. How many? 3? Maybe more behind them. They are circling high to cut off the escape route. He grabbed his gear. He grabbed the old Henry rifle he had, not the one he sold, but an older, rusted spare he kept under the floorboards. It fired, but it wasn't accurate past 100 yards. Stay here, he commanded. Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Where are you going? I am going to draw them off. I will lead them into the ravine to the east. It is a box canyon. I can pin them down there. No, she said, grabbing his arm. That is suicide. It is tactics, he said. If they find the cabin, they burn it. If they burn it, we freeze. I have to take the fight to them. He pulled away from her and slipped out the door. Silas moved through the timber like a ghost. He found the riders' tracks and followed them. He let himself be seen, just a flash of buckskin against the dark trees. He fired a shot into the air. The crack echoed like thunder. Hey, he shouted. Over here, you paid for bastards. He heard a shout in return. A bullet chipped the bark off a pine tree inches from his head. Silas ran. He led them away from the cabin, scrambling over slick rocks, diving through brush. He led them toward the ravine, a narrow slash in the earth filled with scree and deadfall. He dropped behind a fallen log at the mouth of the ravine. He saw them coming, 3 men in dusters, rifles ready. They were confident. They thought they had him cornered. Silas waited. He aimed at the rock face above them. He fired. The bullet struck the loose shale. A slide of rock cascaded down, spooking their horses. The men fought for control. Silas fired again, this time closer to the lead rider, not to kill, but to turn them. Go back, he roared. The next one is between your eyes. The lead rider fired blindly. The bullet ricocheted off the stone and grazed Silas's ribs. It felt like a hot poker being dragged across his side. Silas grunted and fell back. He fired 2 more shots, fast and wild, creating a wall of noise. The riders, unsure of his numbers and spooked by the terrain, pulled back. They retreated, shouting to regroup. Silas waited an hour, clutching his side, watching the trees. When he was sure they were gone, or at least pulled back to the valley to wait for reinforcements, he made his way back to the cabin. He stumbled through the door, his face gray. Clara was there in an instant. She saw the blood soaking his shirt. My God, she whispered. She didn't panic. She helped him to the chair. She cut the shirt away. The bullet had furrowed the flesh over his ribs, a deep graze, bleeding freely, but it hadn't hit bone or lung. Need to cauterize it, Silas gritted out. Or stitch it. Stitch, she said. I am good with a needle. She heated water. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. Silas hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. Clara knelt beside him, her face inches from his bare skin. She worked the needle with steady hands, sewing the jagged edges of his skin back together. Silas watched her. He smelled her scent, wood smoke and sweat and something sweet like dried grass. He felt her breath on his side. She finished and tied the knot. She taped a clean rag over it. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her face was fierce. "You almost died," she said. "Part of the job," Silas murmured. She stood up, her hands resting on his shoulders. The touch was grounding. "You are not a job, Silas, and I am not a job." She leaned in. For a second, he thought she would kiss him. He wanted her to. The adrenaline and the pain had stripped away his defenses. He leaned toward her, but she stopped. She pulled back just an inch. "Not like this," she whispered. "Not while we are running. I won't be another thing you take because you are hurting, and I won't use you just to feel safe." Silas nodded, respecting the line she drew. "You are right," he said. He stood up, wincing. He walked to the window. The sky was heavy, a solid sheet of lead. As he watched, the first flake of snow drifted down, then another, then a curtain of white. "It is starting," Silas said. Clara joined him at the window. "Winter." "Yes, and the pass." Silas turned to her. "We can't stay here. Clara, Vane's men know where we are now. They will come back with more guns. They will burn us out. And if we run, the pass is closing. 2 days, and it will be impassable. If we stay, we are trapped. If we go, we have to go down, toward the towns, toward the law." Clara looked at the snow falling. "Erasing the world. We have to go to the territorial seat," she said, "to Denver, or Santa Fe, somewhere with a real judge." "We need proof," Silas said. "We need the ledger." She said, "The real one." Silas looked at her. She was suggesting they walk back into the lion's den. "It is the only way," she said. "We can run forever. Silas, we can hide in caves and freeze in cabins, but as long as that paper exists, I am a fugitive, and you are a kidnapper." She looked at him, her eyes clear. "I want my name back." Silas looked at the snow, accumulating on the sill. He looked at his rifle. He looked at the woman who had bought his soul with a look across a horse fence. "We leave at dawn," Silas said, "before the snow gets too deep." He checked his revolver. "We are going to get your name back, Clara, or we are going to die trying." The snow fell harder, sealing the cabin in white silence, marking the end of their hiding and the beginning of the war. The descent from the high country was a slow surrender of altitude, trading the clean, killing cold of the peaks for the damp, heavy chill of the foothills. Silas Thorne and Clara Reed rode through a landscape that seemed undecided on whether it wanted to freeze them or drown them. The snow turned to sleet, and the sleet to a miserable, driving rain that turned the trail into a ribbon of black grease. They followed the spine of a windswept ridgeline, the pines thinning out into scrub oak and sage. Wolf tracks, fresh and massive, wove in and out of their own hoof prints, a reminder that they were not the only hunters moving toward the valley floor. On the third day, they crossed the roaring fork, the water gray and swollen, tugging at the horses' bellies. Silas went first, guiding Barnaby against the current, shouting instructions over the roar of the water. Clara followed, her face set in a grim mask, her hands white on the reins. When they reached the far bank, shivering and soaked, they did not speak of the danger. They simply wrung out their wool coats and kept moving. Civilization appeared in fits and starts. A lonely homestead with a chimney leaking smoke, a trapper's line shack, a wagon track cutting through the mud. They stopped at a small ranch tucked into a draw to water the horses. The woman of the house, a sturdy matron named Mrs. Gable, with hands red from lye soap, came out to the porch. She held a shotgun in the crook of her arm until she saw Silas's face. Then she lowered it, though her eyes remained hard. She gave them a loaf of sourdough bread and 2 apples, but she would not invite them inside. She looked at Clara, at her men's trousers, her matted hair, the way she sat her horse astride rather than side saddle. "You are heading to Silverton," Mrs. Gable stated. Not asking. We are, Silas said. Mrs. Gable looked at Clara again. Her expression was not unkind, but it was steeped in the brutal pragmatism of the frontier. A woman is like a china plate. My dear, she said to Clara, once she is cracked, people do not put her back in the cabinet. They use her for slops or they throw her out. You watch yourself in town. Respectability is the only shield a woman has, and you have left yours up on the mountain. Clara took the bread. Her voice was steady. I would rather be a whole person on the mountain than a plate on a shelf, she said. Mrs. Gable frowned, then nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin. Good luck to you. You will need it. They rode on. They passed a trader with a mule train loaded with mining equipment. He offered Silas $5 for the news of the past conditions. Silas took the coin. The trader looked at Clara with a leer that made Silas shift his hand toward his belt. But the man moved on, laughing. They passed a Ute family camped near a stand of cottonwoods. The father watched them pass, his face impassive, his rifle resting easy across his knees. He did not wave, and Silas did not nod. It was a mutual recognition of survival. Two groups of people who knew that the law of the land was often just the whim of the man with the most powder. As the miles fell away, Clara spoke more of the river town she had fled. The stories came in fragments, matching the rhythm of the horse's gait. She told him of the laundry where she had worked, a place of scalding water and raw knuckles. It was a good life. Enough to eat, she said, staring between the dun mare's ears. Then the fire came. It took the building and everything I owned. I was on the street. No family, no money. She paused, swallowing hard against the memory. That is when the fever hit the camps. I got sick. When I woke up, I owed the doctor, I owed the landlord, and I was too weak to stand. Vane's agent was there. He was kind. Silas, that is the worst part. He brought soup. He said, we have work in the territory. We will advance you the travel. You can pay it back $1 a week. She looked at Silas, her eyes dark with the shame of the swindle. I signed. I thought I was saving myself. By the time I realized the interest compounded faster than I could scrub floors. I was in a wagon train headed west, and the debt had doubled. Silas listened, his anger a cold stone in his gut. It was a trap as efficient as any steel jaw he had ever set for a beaver. Use a person's misfortune to bind them, then use the law to keep them bound. We will break it, Silas promised. They rode into Silverton just as the gas lamps were being lit. The town was a scar on the valley floor, a grid of mud streets and timber buildings that smelled of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and money. The noise was a physical blow after the silence of the high country, pianos clanking from saloons, the scream of a steam whistle from the rail yard, the shout of teamsters. They felt the eyes immediately. A mountain man in buckskins and a woman looking like a half-drowned fugitive were not a common sight, even here. Men stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Women in clean dresses pulled their skirts aside as the horses splashed past. Silas saw the judgment. They did not see a victim of fraud. They saw a woman who had fallen, and a man who had likely dragged her down. We need a lawyer, Silas said. They tied the horses at a livery stable, paying extra for oats and a private stall. They walked through the darkening streets. Silas kept himself between Clara and the crowd, his shoulder checking men who got too close. They found the office of a solicitor named Ambrose Blackwood. The shingle was gold-leafed. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and stale cigars. Blackwood listened to their story for 5 minutes, then stood up and opened the door. I do not take charity cases, he said, smoothing his vest. And I certainly do not take cases against Marcus Vane. He owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this building. Good evening. They were turned away from a second lawyer, a young man who laughed and asked if Clara had perhaps enjoyed her time in the wilds a bit too much to claim kidnapping. Silas was ready to break the man's nose, but Clara pulled him away. It is no use, she whispered, her face pale. They are all afraid, or they don't care. There is one more place, Silas said. He led her to a narrow building near the rail yards. The windows were grimy, and the sound of a rhythmic clanking came from within. The sign above the door read, The Silverton Clarion, Josiah Pring, printer-editor. Josiah Pring was a man who looked like he had been dipped in ink and hung up to dry. He was thin, with wild gray hair and spectacles that magnified his cynical eyes. He was setting type when they walked in, his hands moving with the speed of a spider. He listened to Silas without stopping his work. When Silas finished, Pring wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Clara. "Vane," Pring said, "the man is a blight, a tick on the height of this territory." "Will you help us?" Clara asked. Pring sighed. He reached under the counter and pulled out a bottle of rye. "I can't represent you in court. I am not a lawyer. I am just a man who buys ink by the barrel and fights with people who buy bullets by the crate. But I know the law, and I know Vane's clerk." He took a pull from the bottle. "You need the original ledger," Pring said. "The one in the courthouse. Vane claims the debt is valid. If we can prove the dates are impossible, if we can prove he charged you for room and board on days you were not even in his custody, then the contract is void. It is fraud." "Can we get a court order to see it?" Silas asked. Pring laughed. "A court order? In this town? Judge Holloway plays poker with Vane on Tuesdays. No. If you want to see that ledger, you are going to have to be creative." Silas understood. He nodded. "Where are you staying?" Pring asked. "We aren't," Silas said. "Go to the boarding house on 4th Street. The widow who runs it is deaf and doesn't ask questions. Stay off the main street. Vane is in town." Silas stiffened. "Vane is here? He rode in yesterday. Pring said, with a deputy named Hatcher, a man who likes to hurt people and calls it law enforcement. They are looking for you." Silas thanked the printer. They walked to the boarding house in the rain, keeping to the shadows. The room was small, with a sloped ceiling and a single iron bed. The widow had taken Silas's coin and pointed up the stairs without a word. Inside, the air was cold, but dry. Silas lit the kerosene lamp on the bedside table. The yellow light pushed back the gloom, creating a small, intimate circle of warmth. Clara stood by the window, looking down at the muddy street. She was shivering, not from cold, but from the accumulated weight of the stairs she had endured all day. "I saw how they looked at me. Silas," she said softly, like I was something spoiled. Silas took off his wet coat and hung it on a nail. "They are blind," he said. "Are they?" She turned to face him. "If we go to court, Vane will say I am a whore. He will say I ran off with you to sin. He will drag every mistake I ever made into the light. I will be a spectacle, a lesson for other women on what happens when you step out of line." She hugged her arms to her chest. "Maybe it is better to run," she said. "Keep running." Silas crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her. "If we run, he owns you," Silas said. "His name is on the paper. His story is the only one people know. You want to be a ghost, Clara? Or do you want to be free?" "I want to be clean," she whispered. Silas reached out, his hand hovering near her face. "You are clean," he said. "You survived. There is no dirt in that." She looked up at him. The air in the room shifted. The tension of the chase, the adrenaline of the arrival, the fear, it all coalesced into something sharper, heavier. For weeks, they had lived side by side, sleeping feet apart, bound by survival. But here, in this room with 4 walls and a bed, the survival stripped away, leaving only the man and the woman. Silas saw the pulse beating in her throat. He saw the way her lips parted slightly. "Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He stepped closer. The smell of rain and sage on her skin was intoxicating. "I have been afraid of everything for so long," she said. "Afraid of the cold, afraid of Vane, afraid of you." "And now?" Silas asked. "Now I'm just afraid that if you don't touch me, I will shatter." It was an admission that broke the dam. Silas closed the distance. He took her face in his rough hands. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He kissed her. It was not a smooth, practiced kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and exhaustion and a hunger that had been starving in the high country. Silas felt a growl rise in his chest. He wanted to pull her close, to crush the distance between them. But he stopped. He felt her trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of it. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. "Clara," he said. She gripped his shirt, pulling him back. "No, don't stop." Silas held her shoulders, steadying her. "Listen to me," he said. "I want you. God knows I want you. But I am not vain. I don't take things just because they are there." She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark. "I am not offering because I have to," she said fiercely. "I am choosing." Silas looked at the bed, then back to her. "You are sure?" "I am sure." He kissed her again, slower this time. He treated her not like a conquest, but like something rare and fragile that had been entrusted to his care. When they moved to the bed, the old iron springs groaned, but the sound was lost in the drumming of the rain on the roof. There was no conquering in the dark. There was only a desperate, silent language of skin and breath. Two people trying to warm the hollow places inside each other. It was an act of trust so profound it terrified him more than any gunfight. The next morning, the world was gray and businesslike. They ate bread and cheese in the room. The intimacy of the night before hung between them, not as awkwardness, but as a new gravity. They were anchored to each other now. "We need the ledger," Silas said, checking the load in his revolver. Pring said the clerk keeps the records room locked, but the clerk, a man named Holloway, cousin to the judge, eats lunch at the saloon at noon. He leaves the back door unlatched for his own breaks. It is risky. Clara said, "Everything is risky. I will go. You stay here." "No," she said. She stood up, buckling her belt. "I know what an indenture ledger looks like. You wouldn't know a debit from a credit. I'm coming." Silas started to argue, then stopped. She was right, and she was done being left behind. They moved through the alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The courthouse was a brick building in the center of town. They waited in the alley behind it until they saw the clerk, a heavy man with a napkin tucked into his collar, waddle toward the saloon. Silas tried the back door. It was stiff, but unlocked. They slipped inside. The room was lined with shelves of bound books. The smell of dust and dry paper was overwhelming. "Check the dates," Silas whispered, standing guard by the door. Clara moved to the shelf marked 1874, Contracts. She pulled a heavy volume down and flipped the pages. Her finger traced the columns of names. "Here," she whispered. Silas moved to her side. She pointed to the entry. "Sarah Clara Reed. Indenture for debt. Transferred to M. Vane. Look at the charges," she said, her finger trembling. "He charged me $3 a week for room and board starting in May. I wasn't in the territory in May. She said I was still in St. Louis. And here, travel expenses, $50. I paid for my own train ticket. I have the stub in my bag. It was proof. It was sloppy, arrogant fraud, committed by a man who never expected anyone to check the math." "We need to copy this," Silas said, "or take the page." Clara reached for a pen on the desk. "I will copy the entries. If we tear the page, they will say we destroyed evidence." She was writing furiously when the door handle clicked. Silas spun around. He shoved Clara behind a stack of shelves just as the door opened. It wasn't the clerk. It was Deputy Hatcher. He was a big man, wearing a badge that looked too shiny and a duster that hid a shotgun. He stepped into the room, sniffing the air like a hound. "Who is in here?" Hatcher growled. Silas stepped out from the shadows, his hands held away from his body. "Just looking for the records." "Deputy," Silas said calmly. Hatcher smiled. It was a wolf smile. "Well, look at this. The Mountain Man. Vane said you would come sniffing around eventually." Hatcher racked the slide of the shotgun. "Where's the girl?" Silas didn't answer. He calculated the distance. 10 feet. Too far to rush him before he pulled the trigger. "She is gone," Silas said. "Halfway to Mexico." Hatcher laughed. "I don't think so. I saw 2 horses at the livery." Hatcher took a step forward. "Come out, girl, or I blow a hole in your boyfriend here." Clara stepped out. She held the piece of paper she had written on. She held her head high. "I am here," she said. Hatcher's eyes flicked to her. "Well now, you look a sight better than the description." He gestured with the barrel. "Both of you, hands up. We're going to see the judge, and then Mr. Vane wants a word." They walked out into the alley. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist. As they stepped into the narrow passage, Hatcher whistled. 2 more men stepped out from behind rain barrels. Rough men, hired muscle. "Cuff the man," Hatcher said. "Bring the girl." One of the men reached for Clara. He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. She cried out. That was the spark. Silas didn't think. He didn't calculate. The restraint he had cultivated for 20 years snapped. He dropped his shoulder and rammed into Hatcher. The shotgun went off, blowing a hole in the brick wall above them. Silas drove his fist into Hatcher's throat. The deputy gagged and went down. Silas spun. The man holding Clara had let go to reach for his gun. Silas didn't give him the chance. He kicked the man's knee, shattering the joint with a sickening crunch. The man screamed. The third man swung a club. Silas took the blow on his forearm. Ignoring the snap of bone, he grabbed the man by the hair and slammed his face into the brick wall. Once, twice, 3 times. The man slumped, unconscious, blood masking his face. Silas turned back to the man with a broken knee. He was on the ground, reaching for his pistol. Silas stepped on the man's hand, grinding his heel until the fingers broke. Then he reached down, grabbed the man by the throat, and lifted him halfway off the ground. His other hand went to the knife at his belt. He was going to kill him. He was going to open his throat right there in the alley. The red haze blinded him. All he could see was the threat. All he could feel was the need to eradicate it. "Silas!" The voice cut through the roar in his ears. "Silas, stop!" He froze. The knife was an inch from the man's jugular. He looked up. Clara was standing there. She wasn't looking at the men. She was looking at him. Her eyes were wide with horror. "Don't!" she said. Her voice was shaking. "Don't be him. Don't be the monster they say you are." Silas looked at the man in his grip, a whimpering, broken thing. He looked at the knife. He looked at the blood on his own hands. He dropped the man. He stood up, breathing hard. His arm throbbed where the club had hit him. His knuckles were split. "We have the proof," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We take it to Pring. We file the petition. We do this right." Silas looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear for her safety, but fear of him. He realized then how close he had come to losing her, not to Vane, but to the violence inside himself. He nodded, wiping the blood from his hands onto his pants. "Let's go," he rasped. "They left the alley, leaving the groaning men in the mud. They went to Pring. The printer saw the blood and the paper in Clara's hand and didn't ask questions. He drafted the formal complaint right there on his press table. I will file this with the territorial magistrate," Pring said. "Judge Holloway can't ignore a direct petition filed with the territory. It forces a hearing." He looked at Silas. "But you know what this means. You have kicked the hornet's nest. Vane won't send deputies next time." "I know," Silas said. "They filed the papers." By evening, the mood in the town had shifted. Word spread that the mountain man had beaten 3 deputies in an alley. The shopkeepers looked away when they passed. The widow at the boarding house told them they had to leave. She couldn't risk the trouble. They couldn't buy supplies. The general store was suddenly out of stock when Silas walked in. The blacksmith refused to look at Barnaby's shoe. They were pariahs. "We have a court date," Clara said as they sat in a cold barn loft that night, the only shelter they could find. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Silas cleaned his revolver. He checked the action. "The town wants us gone." "Clara," he said, "they don't care about the truth. They care about order. And Vane is order." Clara touched his arm. The bandage on his arm was white against the darkness. "Then we show them a different kind of order," she said. "We walk in there with our heads up. We tell the truth. And if the truth isn't enough, then we fight," she said. "But we fight as people, not as animals." The next morning, the sun rose cold and bright. The street leading to the courthouse was lined with people. They stood in silence, watching. Silas and Clara walked down the center of the muddy street. Silas wore his buckskins, his face bruised, his arm in a sling. Clara wore her travel-stained clothes, but she had washed her face and braided her hair. They felt the weight of every stare. It was a physical pressure, a crushing expectation of failure. Vane was standing on the courthouse steps. He was clean-shaven, wearing a fine suit. He looked like a king surveying his subjects. Silas looked at Vane. He felt the familiar itch in his trigger finger. It would be so easy. One shot, end it. But he felt Clara beside him. She was walking with a steady, rhythmic gait. She was not looking at the ground. She was looking straight ahead at the doors of the courthouse. She was the bravest thing he had ever seen. He exhaled, letting the violence uncoil in his chest. He took his hand away from his gun belt. They reached the steps. Vane smirked. "You are walking into a grave. Thorn," Vane whispered as they passed. Silas stopped. He looked Vane in the eye. "Better a grave than a cage," Silas said. He took Clara's elbow. Together, they walked through the heavy oak doors, into the dim, dusty belly of the law, knowing that the paper in Clara's pocket was the only shield they had against a town that was willing to sell its soul for peace. The courtroom was a box of stagnant air, smelling of wet wool, chewing tobacco, and the sour perspiration of men packed too close together. It was a small room on the ground floor of the brick courthouse, dominated by a high bench that placed the judge halfway to the ceiling, looking down on the proceedings like a bored deity. Silas Thorne sat at a small oak table, his body too large for the chair, his knees pressing against the wood. His arm was throbbing in its sling, a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the pounding of the gavel. Beside him sat Clara Reed. She was sitting with a stillness that terrified him. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers laced so tightly the knuckles were white. She looked at the judge, at the dusty flag hanging limp in the corner, at the fly buzzing against the window pane, anywhere but at the crowd behind them. The room was full. Word had spread through Silverton like fire in dry grass. The mountain man and the runaway were facing Marcus Vane. They had come for the scandal, hungry to see the woman's shame displayed like goods in a store window. Judge Holloway sat behind the bench. He was a man with a face like a dried apple, wrinkled and sour. He shuffled papers, looking annoyed that this matter was disrupting his morning. "Let us have order," Holloway said, his voice scratching through the room. "We are here to hear the petition regarding the contract of one Clara Reed and the counterclaims of Mr. Marcus Vane. Let us keep this brief. I have other matters on the docket." Josiah Pring stood up. The printer looked out of place in his ink-stained apron, which he had swapped for a coat that was 2 sizes too big. He looked nervous, but his eyes behind the spectacles were sharp. "Your Honor," Pring said, "we are here to prove that the contract holding Miss Reed is fraudulent, that the debt was manufactured to enslave her." Vane's lawyer stood up. He was a slick man named Horace Gentry, wearing a suit that cost more than Silas had made in 5 years of trapping. "Objection," Gentry said smoothly. "Enslave is a heavy word. Your Honor, Mr. Vane is a businessman. He extended charity to a destitute woman, and now she refuses to pay the bill. It is a simple matter of debt collection." Vane sat behind his lawyer, looking calm. He caught Silas's eye and offered a small, tight smile. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards and knew the dealer. The proceedings began with Vane's version of the truth. It was a polished, seamless story. Gentry presented papers with flourishes. He called witnesses, men Silas recognized from the horse fair, men who looked like they had been bought with a bottle of whiskey and a silver dollar. They testified that Clara was wild. They testified that she had spent money recklessly in St. Louis. They testified that Vane had been nothing but a benevolent guardian trying to steer a wayward girl onto the path of righteousness. Deputy Hatcher took the stand. He walked with a limp, his face bruised from the alley fight. He glared at Silas. "That man is a menace," Hatcher said, pointing a thick finger at Silas. "He attacked me and 2 sworn deputies. He is a brute. He kidnapped the girl at gunpoint. I saw the fear in her eyes." The crowd murmured. Silas felt the stares burning into his back. Mountain brute, savage, kidnapper. The words hung in the air, thickening the atmosphere. Silas kept his face stone. but under the table. His hand clenched into a fist. He wanted to stand up and roar the truth, but he knew that a roar was exactly what they wanted. They wanted the bear to growl so they could justify putting it down. Then it was Clara's turn. "Call Clara Reed," Pring said. Clara stood up. She walked to the witness chair. She looked small against the dark wood of the paneling. "State your name," the judge said. "Clara Reed." Pring stepped forward. "Miss Reed, tell the court how you came to be in Mr. Vane's debt." Clara took a breath. It was a shaky sound, barely audible. Then she lifted her chin. "I was working in St. Louis," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, after the fire. "I had nothing. Mr. Vane's agent offered me transport to the territory. He said there was work. He said the debt would be $20. And when you arrived?" Pring asked. "The agent told me the cost was $100. Then he added charges for food, for the wagon, for the blankets. By the time we reached the ranch, he said I owed $300. Gentry stood up to cross-examine. He walked toward her like a wolf circling a lamb. "Miss Reed," Gentry said, "you were alone in St. Louis. Were you not? No family, no husband." "I was alone," Clara said. "And why is that? A woman of virtue usually has connections, unless she has severed them." It was a trap, a question designed to plant the seed that she was damaged goods, that her isolation was proof of some secret sin. "I was alone because my parents died of cholera," Clara said, "and my brother was lost in the war. Poverty is not a sin." "Sir," Gentry smiled, a cold curling of his lips. "And yet, you accepted the money. You signed the paper. Did anyone hold a gun to your head?" "No," Clara said. "So you entered the agreement willingly." "I entered it because I was starving," Clara said. Her voice rose. "Just a fraction. I signed because the alternative was the street. I did not know I was signing away my life." Gentry leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or perhaps you saw a wealthy man and thought you could take advantage of his kindness. Perhaps you thought you could take the ride and then run off with the first rough man you found?" The crowd laughed. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Silas started to stand up. Pring put a hand on his arm, pushing him back down. "Sit," Pring hissed. "If you move, you prove them right." Clara looked at Gentry. She did not look down. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. "I am not a thief," she said clearly, "and I am not a whore. I'm a worker who was cheated." Gentry dismissed her with a wave of his hand. She walked back to the table. She sat down and stared straight ahead, but Silas saw the tremor in her hands. She was holding herself together by sheer will. The judge looked at the clock. "Is that all?" Holloway asked. "It seems we have a valid contract and a reluctant debtor. I am inclined to rule for the plaintiff." "Not yet, Your Honor," Pring said. He reached into his oversized coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "We have the matter of the ledger." Vane shifted in his seat. The clerk, the man named Holloway, who was the judge's cousin, looked up from his desk, his eyes widening. Pring walked to the clerk's desk. "We have here a transcription of the original ledger," Pring said, "taken from this very room yesterday." "Objection!" Gentry shouted. "That evidence was obtained illegally." "It is a public record," Pring shouted back, "and it shows a very interesting pattern." Pring turned to the judge. "Your Honor, according to Mr. Vane's claim, Miss Reed incurred charges for room and board beginning on May 12th of this year." "That is correct," Vane called out. Pring held up a piece of paper. "This is a train ticket stub," Pring said. "Dated May 20th, St. Louis to Kansas City. Purchased by Clara Reed." The room went quiet. "If she was on a train in Missouri on the 20th, Pring said, his voice ringing out, "how was she eating Mr. Vane's beef in Colorado on the 12th? He pulled out another paper. "And here, June 1st, a charge for 5 yards of silk. Miss Reed, do you own a silk dress?" "I have never owned silk in my life," Clara said. Pring turned to the clerk. "Mr. Holloway," Pring said to the sweating man at the desk, "you stamped these entries. Did you verify them?" The clerk stammered. I assumed. Mr. Vane is a prominent citizen." Pring slammed the papers onto the desk. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the window. You assumed, or were you told to stamp them? The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was a physical thing, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. The crowd stopped jeering. They looked at Vane. They looked at the judge. The narrative of the righteous businessman was cracking, revealing the rot underneath. Vane stood up. His face was red. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "Clerical errors. My bookkeeper made mistakes. Errors that always favor you?" Pring asked. "Errors that turn a $20 debt into $400. That is not arithmetic. Mr. Vane, that is theft." The judge banged his gavel. "Order. Order in this court." Holloway looked at Vane. He looked at the papers. He looked like a man who was realizing that his poker partner had become a liability. "We will recess for 1 hour." The judge said, "To review the evidence." The gavel came down. Silas and Clara were ushered into a small side room, a holding cell with a single barred window. Pring went to find more coffee. The door clicked shut, leaving them alone in the gloom. Clara slumped against the wall. The strength that had held her upright on the stand evaporated. She slid down until she was sitting on the dirty floor, her head in her hands. "They hate me," she whispered. "Did you hear them? They think I am dirt." Silas knelt beside her. He ignored the pain in his arm. "They don't know you," Silas said. "They know what Vane told them." She said. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "Even if we win, Silas, I can't walk down the street. I will always be the woman who was sold." Silas reached out. He hesitated, then placed his hand on her shoulder. "You are the woman who fought," he said. He pulled her toward him. She did not resist. She leaned into his chest, burying her face in the rough buckskin of his shirt. He wrapped his good arm around her, holding her tight. It was a moment of quiet in the center of the whirlwind. Outside, the town was arguing. Money was changing hands, and men were loading guns. But in here, there was only the sound of their breathing. It wasn't a desperate clutch for safety like it had been in the mountains. It was something deeper. It was an affirmation. "I am here," Silas said into her hair. "I am not going anywhere." Clara pulled back enough to look at him. "They will try to hurt you to get to me," she said. "Let them try." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't want you to die for this," she said. "I am not planning on dying," Silas said. "I am planning on taking you to see the ocean, or maybe just a place where the wind doesn't blow so hard." She smiled. "A weak, watery thing, but real. I would like that," she said. They sat there for a long time, the silence between them filled with the things they didn't have the words for: desire, gratitude, and a terrifying kind of hope. It was a choice. They were choosing this, the danger, the judgment, the fight, because the alternative was a life without this feeling of being entirely, completely seen. The door opened. It was Gentry, Vane's lawyer. He stepped in, closing the door behind him. He looked at them with a mixture of distaste and pity. "A proposition," Gentry said. Silas stood up, putting himself between the lawyer and Clara. "We are listening. Mr. Vane is willing to drop the counterclaims," Gentry said. "He will forgive the debt. Clara walks free." "And?" Silas asked. He heard the trap snapping shut. "And in exchange," Gentry said, "you plead guilty to assault and kidnapping. You serve 5 years in the territorial prison." "No!" Clara shouted. She scrambled to her feet. "It is a generous offer," Gentry said, looking at his fingernails. "If we go back in there, I will call 3 more witnesses who will swear you threatened to kill Vane. The judge is looking for a way out. He will give you 20 years. Thorn, or the rope." "Get out," Silas said. His voice was a low growl. "Think about it," Gentry said. "You want to save her? That is the price." He turned and left. Clara grabbed Silas's arm. "You can't do it. You can't go to prison for me." Silas looked at the door. He was calculating. 5 years was a long time, but 20 was a life. And if he hung, she was alone. "We are not taking the deal," Silas said. "But if they convict you—" "They won't," Silas said, "because we aren't done." The hour passed. The bailiff came for them. The courtroom was even more crowded now. The air was electric. Judge Holloway looked paler. Vane looked smug. "The court is back in session," Holloway said. Before Pring could speak, the back doors of the courtroom banged open. A man walked in. He was young, dressed in dusty ranch clothes, holding his hat in his hands. He looked terrified. Silas recognized him. It was the boy who had been holding the horses at the fair, the one who had watched Vane strike Clara when she stumbled. "Who is this?" the judge demanded. "My name is Elias," the boy said. His voice cracked. "I worked for Mr. Vane. I kept the books before he fired me." Vane stood up. "Get that boy out of here. He's a disgruntled employee. A liar. Sit down." "Mr. Vane," the judge shouted. "Let him speak." Elias walked to the front. He didn't look at Vane. He looked at Clara. "I saw the ledger." Elias said, "The real one. Mr. Vane keeps 2 books. One for the taxman and the court, and one for himself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I took this when he let me go," Elias said. "It shows the real numbers. Clara Reed's debt was $40. She paid back $15. The rest was added on." He handed the book to the judge. Holloway took the book. He opened it. He looked at Vane. Vane's face went from red to a sickly shade of purple. "This is a fabrication," Vane sputtered. The judge looked at the page, then at the clerk's official record. He compared them. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the fly on the window seemed to stop buzzing. "It appears," the judge said slowly, "that there are significant discrepancies." Holloway closed the book. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the election year coming up. He looked at Vane, whose power was suddenly looking very fragile in the face of hard evidence. "The court finds," Holloway said, his voice loud, "that the contract of indenture regarding Clara Reed is invalid due to fraudulent accounting." A gasp went through the room. "The debt is cancelled," Holloway continued. "Miss Reed is free to go." Clara let out a sob. She grabbed Silas's hand. "However," the judge said, raising his voice to drown out the murmur, "regarding the charges of assault against Mr. Thorne." Silas tensed. "Given the circumstances of the fraudulent pursuit, the court dismisses the charges of kidnapping. The assault charges are suspended, pending good behavior. I suggest you leave Silverton. Mr. Thorne, today, it was a half measure, a political sidestep. Vane wasn't arrested. He wasn't charged with fraud. He was just embarrassed. Court adjourned." Holloway banged the gavel and practically ran for his chambers. The room erupted. Pring grabbed Silas's hand and shook it. "We did it," Pring said. "It wasn't perfect, but it is a win." Silas didn't smile. He was watching Vane. Vane wasn't shouting anymore. He was standing perfectly still, staring at Silas. His eyes were dead. He leaned over and whispered something to Gentry, then turned and walked out the side door. Silas felt the hair on his arm stand up. "We need to go," Silas said. "Now." They pushed through the crowd. People stared, but now the looks were different, confused, wary. The narrative had broken, and they didn't know who to hate anymore. They burst out of the courthouse doors. The sky had turned a bruised purple. The wind was whipping dust down the street. The storm that had been threatening all day was breaking. Silas scanned the street. It was too empty. "Get to the horses," Silas said. They ran toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Their boots splashed in the puddles. They were halfway there when the glass of the mercantile window next to them shattered. The crack of the rifle came a split second later. Silas shoved Clara into the doorway of the store. "Down!" he roared. Another shot chewed up the wood of the boardwalk where they had been standing. Vane's men were on the rooftops, and at the end of the street. Silas drew his revolver. He peered around the frame. He saw a muzzle flash from the roof of the saloon. He fired back, 1, 2 shots. He heard a yelp. "They aren't accepting the verdict," Silas shouted over the wind. He looked at Clara. She was huddled in the doorway, her eyes wide. She wasn't screaming. She was reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out the knife he had given her. Silas looked at her and felt a surge of fierce pride. "We have to make the livery," Silas said. "It is 50 yards. I can run," she said. "On my signal." Silas leaned out and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. aiming for the water trough where a man was hiding. The man ducked. "Run!" They sprinted. The mud sucked at their boots. Bullets whined around them like angry hornets. One kicked up mud into Clara's face, but she didn't stop. They crashed into the livery stable. The smell of hay and horse manure was thick. The stable boy was hiding under a pile of straw. Silas grabbed Barnaby's saddle. He threw it on the old horse with a speed born of panic. He didn't bother with the pack, just the saddles. Clara saddled the dun mare. Her hands were shaking, but the knots held. "Mount up," Silas yelled. They swung onto the horses. "We go out the back," Silas said. "We hit the creek bed and ride for the tree line." They kicked the horses into motion. Barnaby snorted and lunged. They burst out the back doors of the stable just as men kicked in the front. They hit the creek at a gallop. The water sprayed high, cold and muddy. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire. But the angle was bad for the shooters. They were moving targets in failing light. They rode hard. They didn't look back until they hit the first line of trees, half a mile out of town. Silas pulled Barnaby up. The horse was heaving. He looked back at Silverton. The town was a cluster of lights in the gathering dark. It looked small, meaningless. "Are you hit?" he asked Clara. She checked herself. "No. You?" Silas felt a sting on his thigh, a splinter of wood or a graze. He didn't know. "I am fine." He looked at the sky. The snow was starting. Heavy, wet flakes that stuck to their eyelashes. "The pass," Clara said. "It will be closed." "We can't stay here," Silas said. "Vane won't stop now. He has lost his reputation. He has to kill us to get it back. So where do we go?" Silas looked at the mountains. They were disappearing behind a white curtain. "We go into the storm," Silas said. "It is the only place they won't follow. But we could freeze," she said. "Maybe," Silas said. "But I would rather freeze free than hang in a cage." Clara nodded. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was strong. "Led the way." "Silas." They turned their horses toward the black wall of the mountains and rode into the teeth of the blizzard, leaving the law and the lies behind them in the mud. The paper in Clara's pocket said she was free, but the gun in Silas's hand said that freedom was something you had to keep buying, bullet by bullet, every single day. The wind did not just blow in the high San Juans. It screamed. It was a physical weight, a wall of white noise and ice crystals that scoured the skin raw and turned breath into instant frost. Silas Thorne and Clara Reed were no longer riding. They were wading through an ocean of white that seemed determined to swallow them whole. The storm that had chased them out of Silverton had evolved into a blizzard that erased the world. There was no sky, no earth, only the biting, swirling gray that blinded the eyes and confused the inner ear. Silas walked ahead of the horses, breaking the trail. He had tied a rope from his waist to Barnaby's bridle, and another from Barnaby to the dun mare. If they separated now, even by 10 feet, they would be lost to each other forever. Every step was a battle. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts, heavy and wet at the bottom, crusted with ice at the top. Silas moved by instinct, feeling the slope of the land beneath the snow, steering them away from the drops he knew were waiting in the whiteout. Barnaby stumbled. The old gelding went down on his knees, groaning, a low, terrible sound that was snatched away by the wind. Silas turned and fought his way back to the horse. He grabbed the bridle, close to the bit. "Get up," Silas roared over the wind. "Get up." "You stubborn old fool." Barnaby tried. His hooves scrambled on the hidden ice, but he sank back down, his head lowering into the snow. He was done. His reserves were spent on the climb out of the valley. Clara slid from the dun mare. She sank into the snow up to her hips, but she pushed through it. Reaching Silas's side, she didn't look terrified anymore. She looked furious. "We can't leave him," she shouted, her voice thin against the gale. "We have to get him to shelter." Silas yelled back. "There is a line shack, half a mile, north face." He pulled on the bridle. Clara got behind the horse and pushed. It was madness. 100 pounds of exhausted woman pushing 1,000 pounds of horse, but the sheer force of her will seemed to transfer to the animal. Barnaby found footing. He surged up, shaking. his legs trembling violently. They moved on. That half-mile took an hour. It was paid for in frostbite and exhaustion so deep it felt like narcotics in the blood. Silas felt his own strength failing, the wound in his arm throbbing with a dull, sickening heat that warned of infection. The shack appeared out of the white like a dark tombstone. It was a miner's shelter, abandoned years ago, half buried in a drift. The roof was sagging, but the walls were log and stone. They broke the door open. Inside, it was freezing, smelling of rat droppings and old decay, but it was out of the wind. They brought the horses inside. There was no room to separate man from beast. They huddled together in the dark, the heat of the animals the only furnace they had. Silas collapsed against the wall. He fumbled for a match with fingers that felt like blocks of wood. He managed to light the small lantern they had taken from the livery. The light revealed their state. Their faces were gray, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes hollowed out by adrenaline and cold. Clara did not collapse. She moved to the saddlebags. She found the last of the jerky and a tin of beans. She fed the horses first, offering the grain from her pockets to Barnaby's soft muzzle. Then she came to Silas. She checked his arm. "It is hot," she said, her voice raspy. "It is fine." Silas lied. "It is not fine." She ripped a strip from her petticoat, a garment that was now filthy and frozen stiff at the hem, and bound the wound tighter. Silas watched her. She had changed. The terrified girl on the fence rail was gone. In her place was something forged in iron. She was moving through pain that would have broken a seasoned drover. "You should eat," Silas said. "We share." She said. She broke the jerky. They ate in silence, listening to the wind try to dismantle the shack. "Are they still coming?" Clara asked. Silas nodded. "Vane is a proud man. We humiliated him in his own town. He won't stop until he wipes that stain out. But in this storm, he has hired trackers." Silas said. "Men who know these mountains almost as well as I do. And he has numbers. They can rotate horses. They can push harder." Clara stared at the lantern flame. "I am the reason you are going to die," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a flat, crushing guilt. Silas sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in his arm. "Stop that! It is true," she said. She looked at him, and her eyes were full of tears that she refused to let fall. "If I surrender, if I go back to him, he will let you go. He just wants his property. He wants to win. If I give him the win, he has no reason to hunt you." Silas reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was hard. "You think he will let me live?" Silas asked. "After I broke his deputy's jaw? After I took you? No, he will kill me either way. But that is not the point." He pulled her closer, forcing her to look at him. "The point is, if you go back to him to save me, you are selling yourself again. You are making yourself a currency. I did not pull you off that fence so you could trade yourself for my life." "I am not worth your life," she shouted, the sudden volume shocking in the small space. "I am a washerwoman with a bad name. You are Silas." "I am a man who has done a lot of bad things," Silas said quietly. "And helping you is the first thing I have done in 20 years that makes me able to sleep without whiskey." He released her wrist. "We do not trade lives. Clara, we stand. We stand together, or we fall together. But we do not bargain with men like Vane." She looked at him, her chest heaving. Then, slowly, the tension left her shoulders. She nodded. "Together," she whispered. The storm broke 2 days later. The silence that followed was deafening. The sun came out, blindingly bright, turning the world into an expanse of glittering diamonds. They left the shack. The snow was deep, but the crust had hardened enough to support the horses if they moved carefully. They found the tragedy 3 miles down the ridge. It was a splash of color against the white, blue and gray. Silas saw it first and tried to steer Barnaby away, but Clara had already seen it. It was a body, half buried in the snow near a stand of aspen. They rode closer. It was not a stranger. It was Elias, the boy who had brought the ledger to the court. He was frozen solid, curled into a ball, but he hadn't died of the cold. There was a dark, frozen stain on the back of his coat. He had been shot from behind. Pinned to the tree above him was a piece of paper. It fluttered in the light breeze. Silas dismounted. He walked to the tree. He pulled the paper down. It was a page from the false ledger. Scrawled across it in charcoal were the words, "The price of theft." Silas felt a sickness rise in his throat. Vane hadn't just killed the boy. He had hunted him down, shot him like a dog, and left him here on the trail he knew Silas would take. It was a message. It was a promise. Clara walked up behind him. She looked at Elias. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went very still. "He helped us," she said. Her voice was devoid of emotion, cold as the ice under their feet. He told the truth, and they killed him for it. "This is my fault," Silas said. "I should have told him to run." Clara turned to Silas. Her eyes were terrifying. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a judge passing sentence. "No," she said. "It is Vane's fault." She reached down and touched the boy's frozen shoulder. "We are not running anymore. Silas." Silas looked at her. He saw the shift. She was done with fear. She was done with flight. "No," Silas agreed. "We are not." He looked at the terrain. They were near the Narrows, a place where the trail cut through a slot canyon with high, unstable walls of snow looming above. It was a death trap for anyone foolish enough to ride through it with noise and arrogance. "He knows the land less than I do," Silas said. "He thinks he is the hunter." "Then let us make him the prey," Clara said. They spent the next hour preparing the ground. It was not a fair fight, so they made it unfair. Silas knew how to trigger the weight of the snow. He used branches and leverage, setting deadfalls that would not kill, but would block the retreat. He positioned them on the high ground, looking down into the throat of the canyon. They sent the horses further up the trail, tied safely in a grove of spruce. They waited in the rocks, hidden by the glare of the sun. Silas checked his revolver. He had 6 shots. He had the old Henry rifle with 4 cartridges left. Clara had the knife and a small pocket pistol Silas had taken from the shack, a rusted thing that might fire or might explode. Silas looked at Clara. She was lying prone in the snow beside him, watching the trail. "Clara," he said. She turned. "If this goes wrong," he said, "you take the dun mare. You ride for the pass. Do not look back." She shook her head. "No more pretending. Silas, we made a vow." She reached out and took his gloved hand. "I am not going anywhere without you. If we build a life, we build it. If we die, we die. But I am done being separated from the only person who ever saw me." Silas felt a fierce swelling in his chest. It was a love that felt like iron, heavy and unbreakable. "Okay," he said. They heard the horses 10 minutes later. Vane rode in the lead. He was wearing a fur coat that looked like it cost $1,000. He rode a black stallion that was fighting the deep snow. Behind him were 4 men, Deputy Hatcher, looking bandaged and angry, and 3 hired trackers with rifles across their saddles. They rode into the canyon. Vane was shouting orders, his voice echoing off the walls. "Keep your eyes up! They're close! I can smell them!" He stopped in the center of the clearing, right below where Silas and Clara lay hidden. He saw the tracks ending. He looked around, confused. "Thorn!" Vane shouted. "Come out! I know you are here." Silas stood up. He stepped to the edge of the overhang, 30 feet above them. "I am here! Vane!" Vane's head snapped up. He smiled. "There you are. The hero of the high country. Where is the girl?" Clara stood up beside Silas. "I am right here, Marcus." Vane's smile faltered. He didn't like her using his first name. It implied equality. "Come down." "Sarah," Vane said. "The game is over. The boy is dead. You saw him? That is what happens to traitors." "I saw him." Clara called down. "I saw a child murdered by a coward." Vane's face darkened. "Watch your mouth. You are my property. You are a debt on a ledger." "I am a free woman," Clara shouted, her voice ringing off the stone. "The court said so. The court is 100 miles away," Vane roared. "Up here, I am the court. I am the law. Now come down, or my men will cut your mountain man into pieces." Silas looked at the snow cornice hanging above the canyon entrance behind Vane's men. "Vane," Silas said calmly, "you brought loud guns into a quiet place." Vane laughed. "Is that a threat? It is a lesson." Silas raised the Henry rifle. He didn't aim at Vane. He aimed at the cornice above the entrance. He fired. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the narrow space. The bullet hit the rock. The vibration, combined with the echo, did the rest. The sheet of snow above the canyon entrance gave way. It wasn't a massive avalanche, but it was enough. Tons of white powder cascaded down, blocking the path behind Vane, burying the two rear trackers and their horses in a suffocating cloud. Panic erupted. The remaining horses reared. Silas dropped the rifle and drew his revolver. Now! He fired at Hatcher. The bullet struck the deputy in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The remaining tracker fired back. A bullet chipped the rock by Silas's face, sending stone fragments into his cheek. Silas returned fire, hitting the tracker's horse. The animal went down, trapping the man's leg. It was chaos. Vane was struggling to control his stallion. He pulled a long-barreled pistol from his coat. He didn't aim at Silas. He aimed at Clara. Silas saw it. He moved. He threw himself in front of her just as Vane fired. The bullet hit Silas in the chest. It felt like being kicked by a mule. The air left his lungs. He fell back, hitting the snow hard. "Silas!" Clara screamed. Vane laughed. He steadied his horse. He aimed the gun at Silas, who was struggling to rise, blood pouring from his coat. "I told you, Thorn. I always win." Vane cocked the hammer for the kill shot. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She didn't use the rusted pistol. She jumped. She leaped from the overhang. A drop of 15 feet. She landed on Vane, hitting him with the force of a falling boulder. They crashed out of the saddle together, landing in the churned snow. Vane was big, but he was soft. Clara was thin, but she was desperate. They rolled. Vane struck her across the face. Clara clawed at his eyes. Vane got his hands around her throat. He squeezed, his face purple with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he spat. Clara's vision spotted. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the bone handle of the knife Silas had given her. "There is no debt here." She pulled the knife. She drove it into Vane's shoulder, burying it to the hilt. Vane screamed and let go. Clara rolled away. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. She held the bloody knife out. Vane clutched his shoulder. He looked at her with shock. He reached for his fallen pistol in the snow. Clara kicked it away. She stood over him. She was breathing hard, blood from her lip dripping onto the snow. "Get up," she said. Vane looked at her. He looked at the knife. He looked at his men, buried, wounded, or trapped. You can't kill me," Vane stammered. "I am Marcus Vane." Clara stepped closer. "I am not going to kill you, Marcus. That would be too easy." She looked up. Silas was sliding down the embankment, clutching his chest. He was pale, but he was moving. He reached them. He looked at Vane, then at Clara. "You got him," Silas wheezed. "We got him," Clara corrected. Vane looked at the devastation. The avalanche had sealed the pass behind them. The only way out was forward, through the high pass, under their guard. "You are going to walk." "Vane," Silas said, his voice wet. "You are going to walk back to town, and you are going to tell everyone how a washerwoman and a cripple beat you. They tied Vane's hands. They collected Hatcher, who was groaning but alive. The other trackers had fled or were digging themselves out to run the other way. The journey back was a death march. Silas rode Barnaby, too weak to walk. Clara led the horse. Vane walked behind them, tied to the saddle horn, stumbling in the snow. Silas's wound was bad. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Clara kept him talking. "Tell me about the ocean. Silas, tell me what it looks like." "It is blue," Silas whispered. "Endless. Like the sky, but wet." "We will go there," she said. "Just stay with me." They came down from the mountains 3 days later. They looked like apparitions. Clara was gaunt, her skin wind-burned black. Silas was slumped over the horse's neck, barely holding on. Vane was a broken man, frostbitten and weeping, stripped of his furs and his dignity. They rode into the valley as the sun crested the peaks. The light was blinding, sharp and cold. They didn't stop at the outskirts. They rode straight down the main street of Silverton. People came out of the shops. They stopped on the boardwalks. Silence rippled through the town. They saw the mountain man, bleeding and gray. They saw the ranch boss, stumbling like a prisoner of war. And leading them, walking tall despite the exhaustion, was the woman. She didn't look down. She looked every person she passed in the eye. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Clara untied the rope. Vane collapsed into the mud. "Sheriff!" Clara shouted. Her voice was cracked, but it carried to the end of the street. The sheriff came out, coffee cup in hand. He stared. "I am returning a thief," Clara said, pointing at Vane. "He stole a life. He killed a boy, and he tried to murder us." She reached into her coat and pulled out the blood-stained page from the ledger, the one they had found on Elias. "Here is the proof," she said. She dropped the paper on Vane's chest. Silas slid from the horse. He stumbled, and Clara caught him. She held his weight, her small frame bracing his large one. "We are done running," Silas rasped, looking at the crowd. He looked at the faces, the same faces that had judged them, mocked them, hunted them. "If you want to hang someone," Silas said, "hang him, but we are staying." He looked at Clara. "We are home." Clara looked at him. She smiled, and despite the blood and the grime, it was the most beautiful thing Silas had ever seen. "Yes," she said, "we are." They turned and walked toward the doctor's office, leaning on each other, leaving the powerful man in the mud and the town to reckon with the truth they had brought down from the cold. The winter sun shone on them, harsh and unforgiving, but they didn't mind. They were finally out of the shadows. The doctor's office in Silverton smelled of iodine and stale pipe tobacco. It was a clean smell, sharp and unyielding, much like the reality that had settled over the town in the wake of the blizzard. Silas Thorne sat on the edge of the examination table, his chest wrapped in fresh white linen that felt too tight against his ribs. The bullet had missed the lung, glancing off a rib and exiting through the muscle of his back. But the loss of blood had left him hollowed out, as if the wind were blowing right through his bones. Clara Reed sat in a wooden chair by the window. She had scrubbed the mountain dirt from her skin, but the sun-darkened rough patch on her cheeks remained, a badge of the high country. She was watching the street outside, where the snow was turning to gray slush under the wheels of passing wagons. The door opened, and Sheriff Miller walked in. He looked tired. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim in a slow, nervous circle. "He is in the cell," Miller said. His voice was gruff, avoiding Silas's eyes. "The circuit judge is due in 3 days, with the ledger page and the testimony about the boy. Well, Vane is done." "Done?" Silas asked. His voice was a rasp. "His assets are frozen," Miller said. "The bank is calling in his loans. It seems Mr. Vane was leveraging his cattle to pay for his mining interests, and leveraging his mines to pay for his cattle. It was a house of cards." "Silas, you and the girl just pulled the bottom card out." Clara turned from the window. "He killed Elias. She said it was not a question." Miller nodded. "We found the ballistics match. The rifle was in his saddle scabbard. That is a hanging offense. Miss Reed, even in this territory." He looked at Clara, really looked at her, for the first time without the lens of judgment. "You are free," he said. "The magistrate has already signed the order. The indenture is voided. You can go wherever you like." Clara did not smile. Freedom was not a sudden burst of light. It was just the heavy realization that she now had to decide where to put her feet. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. Miller lingered. He looked at Silas. "Thorne," he said, "there is a lot of talk. People are unsettled. They see you, and they remember what they let happen. They remember they stood by while a man like Vane ran this town. It makes them ashamed, and ashamed men get angry." "I know the look," Silas said. "It might be best," Miller said, putting his hat back on. If you moved on, let the town forget. Let the wound scar over. He nodded to them both and left. The silence he left behind was heavy. Silas slid off the table, gritting his teeth against the pull of the stitches. He reached for his shirt, stiff with dried blood and mud. But Clara was there first. She held out a clean flannel shirt, new, blue plaid, smelling of store starch. "Where did you get this?" Silas asked. "Josiah Pring brought it," she said, "and Mrs. Gable sent a loaf of bread." Silas put the shirt on. It felt strange, clean cotton against skin that was used to buckskin and sweat. "He is right," Silas said. "Who?" "The sheriff. You are free. Clara, you have papers now. You can get a job. Pring would hire you at the press. Mrs. Gable might take you on. You could have a life here, a real life." Clara watched him button the shirt. "And you?" she asked. "I am a reminder," Silas said. "I walk down the street, and they see the violence. They see the fact that their law failed and a savage had to fix it. I curdle the milk just by standing there." He picked up his gun belt. "I am going back up. Clara, not to the high cabin. Vane's men burned it, but I know a spot near the timberline on the west slope. Alone? It is how I live." Clara did not argue. She did not cry. She simply watched him buckle the belt, her face unreadable. They walked out of the doctor's office into the glare of the winter sun. The town was busy. People hurried along the boardwalks, their breath steaming. When they saw Silas and Clara, they stepped aside. It was not the fearful recoil of before. It was an awkward, eyes-down deference. They were ghosts haunting the town's conscience. A shopkeeper, a man who had refused to sell them grain 2 weeks ago, nodded stiffly as they passed. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and watched them, her hand resting on her broom, a look of confused apology on her face. They walked to the livery stable. Barnaby and the dun mare were waiting. Fed and brushed, the stable boy, a new one, refused Silas's coin. "Mr. Pring paid for the board." The boy mumbled, said it was the least the town could do. Silas saddled Barnaby. The motion hurt, but it was a good pain, a familiar pain. It meant he was leaving. He led the horse out into the sunlight. Clara followed with the dun mare. Silas turned to her. He had a speech prepared. He was going to tell her that she deserved soft sheets and windows that didn't rattle in the wind. He was going to tell her that he was too broken to be a foundation for anything. "Goodbye." "Clara," he said. Clara looked at him. She swung herself into the saddle of the dun mare. She checked her cinch. She adjusted her reins. Then she looked down at him. "Which way is the west slope?" she asked. Silas blinked. "Clara, I am not staying here. Silas, this is civilization," Silas said, gesturing at the muddy street. "This is what we fought for. You have a chance here. I have a chance to be the woman who was a victim." She said, "To be the charity case. To have people whisper about me in the mercantile for the rest of my life." She leaned forward, resting her hands on the saddle horn. "I do not want to be saved anymore. Silas, I want to live. And I do not want to live in a town that needed a gunfight to remember I was a human being." Silas looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the way she sat the horse, balanced, ready. "It is hard up there," Silas said. "The soil is thin. The winter is long." "I know," she said. "I am hard." Silas said, "I don't know how to be soft. I don't know how to be a husband. I am not looking for a husband." She said, "I am looking for a partner. Someone who knows that the wolf is always at the door and doesn't pretend it is a dog." She held out her hand. "I choose you, Silas. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because when I look at the mountains, I see home. And when I look at you, I see the man who showed me I could survive them." Silas looked at her hand. It was rough, scarred from the cold. The nails short. It was a working hand. He reached up and took it. Her grip was warm and solid. "West slope," Silas said, his voice thick. "Lead the way." They turned their horses away from the town, away from the railroad and the law courts and the polite society that had almost destroyed them. They rode past the last fence line, past the graveyard where they had buried Elias that morning. and up into the timber. They built the new cabin in a valley known as Lost Creek. It was lower than the eagle's nest Silas had lived in before, but high enough that the air stayed crisp even in August. It was not a romance of easy days. It was a romance of labor. They felled the trees together, Clara swinging an axe with a rhythm she learned from watching him. They peeled the logs, their hands sticky with pine sap. They mixed the mud for the chinking, working side by side until their backs ached and the sun dipped below the ridge line. Silas started a small horse line, catching wild mustangs from the basin and breaking them with a patience that surprised him. He didn't break their spirits. He gentled them. He taught Clara the language of the horse, the ear flick, the tail swish, the way fear smelled like copper. Clara planted a garden. The soil was rocky and stubborn, but she fought it. She hauled river stones to build a wall. She carried buckets of water from the creek until her shoulders burned. She grew potatoes, turnips, and a row of hardy beans. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. There was no debt, no ledger, no one watching them to see if they would fail. The intimacy between them grew slowly, like a tree taking root in stone. At night, in the dark of the cabin, Silas would hold her. He didn't demand, he didn't take, he waited. And when she turned to him, it was with a fierceness that matched the land outside. It was a claiming. They healed each other not with words, but with the steady, undeniable presence of skin against skin, warmth against cold. One night in late autumn, the wind was howling around the eaves. They were sitting by the fire, mending tack. Clara put down her needle. She looked into the flames. "My name wasn't Clara," she said, not at first. Silas stopped working. He didn't look up, giving her the space she needed. "It was Lucinda," she said softly. "Lucinda Hale." She picked at a loose thread on the blanket. "When the fire happened in St. Louis, I didn't just lose my home. I had a sister, Mary. She was 6. Silas watched the fire, his heart aching for her. The building was burning. She said, "The smoke was so black. I grabbed my bag. I ran for the door. I thought she was right behind me. I thought—" She took a ragged breath. "When I got to the street, she wasn't there. I tried to go back in, but the stairs were gone. I heard her, Silas. I heard her calling me, and I stood there. I stood there and I let her burn because I was too scared to die." Tears ran down her face, gleaming in the firelight. "I changed my name because Lucinda was the girl who let her sister die. Clara was just a ghost. I thought if I suffered enough, if I worked hard enough, I could pay for her. That is why I signed the contract with Vane. I thought I deserved the cage." She looked at him then, her eyes dark with the confession. "You saved a coward. Silas." Silas set the bridle down. He moved from his chair to the rug beside her. He took her hands in his. "You were a child," he said. "I ran. You survived. Fire is a beast. Clara, it eats everything. It doesn't judge. It just eats." He looked at her, his face open, stripped of his usual stoicism. "You think you are stained," he said. "You think that fear makes you weak. But look at you. You walked into a blizzard to save a horse. You jumped off a cliff to save me. You stood up to Vane when the whole world told you to sit down." He brought her hands to his lips. "Lucinda might have run," he said, "but Clara stands. And I love the woman who stands." She broke then. The sobs came deep and hard, shaking her frame. Silas held her. He rocked her while she wept for the sister she couldn't save and the years she had spent punishing herself for it. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't okay. It was a wound. But he showed her that the wound didn't have to be a grave. Spring brought a final test. The snow melted, turning the creeks into roaring torrents. A rider came up the trail, not an enemy, but not quite a friend. It was the new deputy from Silverton, a young man who looked nervous to be so far from the pavement. He rode into the yard, eyeing the cabin, the corral with 4 solid horses, the green shoots in the garden. Silas came out of the barn, a hammer in his hand. Clara stood on the porch, a rifle leaning casually against the railing. "Can we help you?" Silas asked. The deputy cleared his throat. "There has been an appeal," he said. "Vane's lawyers in Denver. They are trying to claim the seizure of his assets was unlawful. They are saying the testimony was coerced. Silas tightened his grip on the hammer. And they are sending an investigator. The deputy said, to interview witnesses. They are going to try to drag your name through the mud again. Miss Reed, they are saying you were a woman of low character who seduced Vane and then robbed him. Clara stepped off the porch. She walked up to the deputy's horse. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed. Let them come, she said. The deputy blinked. Excuse me? Let them come, she repeated. I have a garden to weed and horses to feed. I don't have time for Denver lawyers. But if they want to ride up here, they can. And I will tell them the exact same truth I told the judge. She looked the deputy in the eye. And tell them this, she added. I am not Clara Reed the fugitive anymore. I am Clara Thorne, and this is my land. If they come with papers, we will talk. If they come with anything else. She glanced at Silas. Silas just looked at the deputy, a calm, dangerous stillness in his posture. Then they better bring more men than Vane did. Clara finished. The deputy looked at her, then at the orderly. Hard-won life they had built. He nodded. I will tell them, he said. And, for what it is worth, ma'am, the town doesn't believe Vane anymore. Josiah Pring wrote an editorial, called you the Iron Lady of the San Juans. People like that. He tipped his hat and rode away. Clara watched him go. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Clara Thorne? Silas asked, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth under his beard. Clara shrugged, turning to face him. The sun caught the stray hairs escaping her braid, turning them to gold. It sounded right, she said, and I am tired of changing names. I think I will keep this one. Silas pulled her close. I think you should. The years moved on. The cabin grew another room. The herd grew. They guided hunters in the fall, honest men who paid fair wages, and trapped in the winter. They never became rich. The work was always there, waiting at dawn. But they were part of the mountain now. They went into town rarely, but when they did, they walked arm in arm. They saw the prejudice still lingering in some eyes, the whispers about the mountain man and his stray bride. But it didn't touch them. They had built a fortress of shared experience that no whisper could breach. Some people in town, the blacksmith, the printer, the young deputy, became friends. They would come up for coffee, sitting on the porch, marveling at the view. They saw what Silas and Clara had built. They saw a partnership that was not based on ownership or duty, but on a profound, terrifying, beautiful equality. One night, 5 years after the trial, they stood on the porch of the cabin. It was winter again. The air was sharp, biting with the promise of snow. The moon was full, illuminating the peaks of the San Juans in stark relief. They looked like jagged teeth biting into the sky. Silas put his arm around Clara's waist. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Her hair was streaked with gray now, and his beard was more salt than pepper. Do you remember the fence? Silas asked quietly. Clara nodded against his coat. I remember thinking my life was over. And now? Clara looked out at the valley. She saw the smoke rising from their chimney. She saw the horses huddled together in the corral, warm and safe. She felt the beat of Silas's heart against her back. She thought about the fire in St. Louis. She thought about Vane. She thought about the boy, Elias, buried under the aspen tree. The tragedy was there. It was woven into the fabric of who they were. They carried their ghosts. Silas carried the men he had killed. Clara carried the sisters she had lost. They were not unbroken. But they were standing. Now, Clara said, watching the moonlight glint off the snow. Now I think the fence was just a gate, and we kicked it down. Silas tightened his hold on her. Winter is coming, he said. Let it come, Clara answered. We have plenty of wood. They stood there for a long time, watching the mountains that had once been a prison and were now a cathedral. Two scarred people who had found the only thing in the West more powerful than the land itself. The choice to belong to each other. Thank you so much for listening to Mountain Man Went to Buy Horses, Saw Woman on Fence and Bought Her Instead. I hope this story of Silas and Clara resonated with you. It was a journey through the harsh and beautiful landscape of the human heart. and I truly enjoyed bringing it to life for you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. Are you listening from the mountains, the city, or somewhere in between? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of grit, romance, and survival on the American frontier. And finally, please share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did Silas and Clara find the justice they deserved? What did you think of their choice to stay in the mountains? I read every comment and would love to hear your perspective. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.